First Nations people were seen as being uncivilized because they were not farmers like other settlers in Western Canada. As a process to civilization, the agents of colonialism were determined to make them farmers, but as for the coastal First Nations people, they had very little land that wasn't suitable for farming on. The interior First Nations had more access to land, but because of the discriminatory laws set against them, it was more difficult for them to farm compared to the European settlers. A process called homesteading was introduced, but First Nations people could not participate. This meant other people could get land for cheap and sometimes even for free as long as they improved the land. The First Nations and European techniques of agriculture were very different. Europeans only produced a small number of plants, and they stayed in one place all year round. Whereas the First Nations used a wide variety of plants, they covered huge areas of land to hunt and gather food, and they shifted their living areas with the seasons. Eventually, First Nations people did become involved in agriculture. Subsistence farming was one of the three ways they were involved. This farming was farming to provide for the family and include potato gardens. The second form of farming was commercial, which was business, but things like the economy made it hard for the small farmers. For First Nations people, it was very difficult because of the restrictions they faced, like how they only could farm a reserve land and didn't have access to water for irrigation. The third way was to become a laborer for a big farm. This way fit the First Nations people because they could continue with their seasonal activities. One of the first agricultural enterprises that hired large numbers of First Nations as seasonal workers. Flowers of the hop plant was used in making of beer that ripened in late August or early September. They required hundreds of workers. Hop farmers of western Washington, the Saanich Peninsula, Fraser River, and the Okanagan Valley depended on the First Nations workers from the 1870s to the 1940s. Workers earned about 1 cent a pound, while faster workers could pick 300 pounds in a day, earning a total of $3 a day. In the 1860s, cattle ranching was introduced to the interior of BC from the United States. Newcomers to Canada liked the idea and took large amounts of land to ranch cattle. The colonial government would sell or lease the land for very little. The ranching took place in the Okanagan Valley, Nicola Valley, and Caribou and Chilcotin country. The idea of ranching was fitting to the First Nation lifestyle since they were already expert riders and breeded horses, but for most of the ranching was not an option. Only some were an exception and could run their own ranches. Farming in the Okanagan. British Columbia's prime agricultural areas is the Okanagan Valley. The Okanagan tribes are members of the Interior Salish language family. Traditional economy produced a wide range of food and materials. These are dry lands, except lakes that run in a north-south corridor. First settlers arrived in the 1880s. They were familiar with the agricultural methods. They grew potatoes in the 1840s. Governor James Douglas negotiated peace agreements with the Okanagan to avoid conflict between First Nations and newcomers. Okanagan chiefs agreed to permit Europeans to share their land and resources as long as they were guaranteed the ability to continue with traditional hunting and fishing practices. Douglas retired in 1864. Colonial policies involving First Nation lands were taken over by Joseph Trutch. Reserves marked out by Cox were ignored. Ranching was a way of life in the Okanagan during the last decades of the 1800s. in the 20th century, the cattle industry was disappearing from the Okanagan.